Welcome back everyone to the first of a few videos on polymorphism and virtual functions. Alright, so the kinds of things we're going to do in this chapter, which is chapter 15 in the Savage book, we will look at virtual functions. These are always member functions of classes in the context of inheritance. So you'll have a base class and a derived class. So if you've forgotten, base classes are superclasses. That's what we used to refer to them as in Java when we took the Java course, and derived classes are subclasses. So in the context of, let's say, a pair of classes, and it can be more than two classes, a superclass and a subclass, or a base class and a derived class, these two classes will probably have some kind of methods in Java, member functions in C++, and some of those methods or functions can be virtual. And that it turns out to be the key to polymorphism. So virtual functions are key to understanding how polymorphism works in C++. You may ask, well, how come we didn't see this in Java? The reason is that in Java, the designers of Java decided to make all methods virtual. So you don't see virtual because every method in Java is virtual. Okay, so when we start out, we won't use virtual and things will behave kind of oddly, and it turns out to use good object-oriented programming features such as polymorphism, you have to use virtual. So the key is basically use virtual, it turns out, just like in Java. Okay, so we'll look at some of the basics. Late binding is the technical term used to understand how virtual functions work. The idea is that when you set up a derived class, you override the virtual functions that you have in the base class. That way you have the option, if you don't override it, you'll call the virtual function of the base class. If you do override it, you will call the virtual function of the derived class. Okay, and you can, that binding, that is deciding which virtual function to call, is decided at runtime, not at compile time. So at compile time, actually you don't know which function is going to be called. Is it going to be the member function of the superclass or the subclass? That's only decided late in the process of running a program, that is at runtime. That's why it's called late binding. That virtual member function is sort of bound to what you want to use at runtime. Okay. Turns out after doing all of that, implementing virtual functions is pretty simple. You just put virtual. You just put virtual on just about everything, usually. Almost everything. And we look at when to use a virtual function. Remember, in Java, we always use virtual functions. So a good rule of thumb for Java programmers is basically make just about all your member functions virtual if you're going to use inheritance. Later on, we'll look at, if you get time, we'll look at pure virtual functions. So those are virtual functions with no method bodies. Those are abstract methods. That's what we used to refer to them in Java and C++. They're called pure virtual. Same thing. Okay, then we will look at maybe some features and problems with pointers and virtual functions. We will look at extended type compatibility, downcasting and upcasting, that is used pretending a member function belongs to a superclass in the case of downcasting, and in the case of upcasting, and a subclass in the case of downcasting. So you want to think of the hierarchy. Super is, or a base class is above the derived class, which is below. And so if you try to use an object which is actually a derived class as if it were a superclass, that's called upcasting. and if you try to use an object that you refer to as a base class, use it as a subclass or derived class, that's downcasting. All right, we'll see it when we get to that. So that's the whole idea there. And then underneath the hood, all of this works with virtual tables, which we don't really get into in a whole lot of detail. But if you really want to understand C++, you want to understand virtual tables. That's the key to understanding classes and polymorphism in C++, but we actually won't get a whole lot into this. The book goes over it in a little bit of detail. It's not essential to understanding how to use polymorphism. Okay, so virtual function basics. The whole reason for doing this is polymorphism. The word polymorphism comes from Greek. Poly means many, morph means shape, so that is associating many shapes or meanings to one thing. And how do you do this? The key to this is virtual functions. That is using the virtual keyword in C++. And this is a fundamental principle of object-oriented programming. You want to use polymorphism because it does a lot. It helps you with code reuse. It helps you with making things just plain easier to use. Your classes, that is. Okay, so why virtual? The idea is that you exist in essence, but maybe not in fact. So you make something virtual. You may have a function of that. You may have a function in the subclass or derived class that overrides that virtual function. You may not. You may just use the virtual function that's already provided in the base class. Okay, the idea is that you can sort of use it before it's actually defined, and maybe this refers to late binding. That is, you don't know which one you're actually going to use. It's in the code, but you don't know actually exactly which function it's going to use until runtime. So the thing that makes this really powerful is that this will work once you set up a class with virtual functions. Then if at some later point in the future you add new classes to the hierarchy, that is, you add subclasses or derived classes, then everything, if it's designed right, everything will work even though you don't even know what kind of classes are going to be added in the future. So that's a really powerful thing. That is, basically you're going to be able to write code that will work in the future even though you don't know exactly what kind of classes you're working with. That is super powerful. So that's one of the main things that you get out of virtual functions, polymorphism, nice object-oriented programming techniques. Okay, so the book goes over this figures example. It doesn't give you code, it just sort of makes you think about this. This is sort of like a thought experiment. So let's say you have several different kinds of classes: rectangles, circles, ovals, and each figure, so these are all figures of and these are separate classes. So you have a rectangle class, circle class, oval class, but they all derive from one parent class, that is figure. So you have a parent class which can be an abstract class, let's say it's figure, and then you have all these derived classes or subclasses called rectangle, circle, oval, and so on. And let's say each figure has certain data members, for example, height, width, center. In the case of rectangle, in the case of circle, you won't have height or width, you'll just have a radius or a diameter, let's say radius, and then a center point. Okay, so let's say we require this function draw, which is in the figure class. Of course, in the figure, since it's a little bit more abstract, you probably want to make this a pure virtual or an abstract member function. Okay, and then in each of the subclasses or the derived classes, in rectangle you draw a certain way, that is, you use a height and width and a center. In circle you use a center point and a radius. Okay, so each class needs a different draw function. So if you, let's say you set up a rectangle object R, a circle object C, you can, let's say you can call the draw method that belongs to R, the draw method that belongs to C. Okay, so nothing new here yet. We're just using basic inheritance, let's say. So if you have, let's say you have another member function called center. The parent class figure contains functions that apply to all figures. So let's say you have a center function which moves a figure to the center of the screen, erases what was there before the move, and then redraws this new redraws this whatever object it is, circle, rectangle, whatever, and puts it in the center. So the center method of the figure class, which is, remember, it's just an abstract class, would use a function draw to redraw. So it has to, the center, inside center, you have to call the draw method of the appropriate class. Now the complication is, which draw function does it call from which class? That is, does it, if you call the center method or member function of a figure object, does it call a rectangle draw function or a circle draw function? As we saw before, these are two very different things. Rectangle uses length and width, circle uses center and diameter or radius. Okay, so let's say, so that is a problem, and we'll see how to use it. Of course, the solution is to use virtual, but let's consider now a new figure class, that is a new subclass or derived class from figure called the triangle class. Now the center function, which is in the figure class, we have to ask, will it work for triangles? So the idea is, even if you didn't anticipate having to handle triangles, your code should work, even if someone adds a triangle class as a subclass of figure. Okay, so question is, will whatever you set up right now, we haven't shown any code, the book doesn't either, this is just, you want to think about this, will it work for triangles? So the center method, or center member function, if you remember, it's supposed to use draw, which is different for each figure, rectangle, circle, triangle. And it will use, let's say, the draw method of the draw member function of figure, which won't work for triangles, or it might use the draw method somehow for rectangles and circles, but maybe you haven't set it up to make it work correctly for triangles. We want this inherited function center to use the draw method or draw member function of the triangle, but not the draw member function of the figure class. But then here's the thing, this triangle class wasn't even written when the center member function was set up. So the center member function, in case you're like figuring out the type of thing and calling rectangle if the actual object is of type rectangle and so on, you can't really check for everything that someone might write in the future. So that kind of checking is not a good way to implement this center member function, because it doesn't even know about triangles. You cannot put a check in for all the things that you don't know. Okay, so it turns out, yeah, the answer to all of this is to use virtual functions. And it tells the compiler, we don't know how the function is implemented, but wait until it's used in the program. Then get the implementation from the object instance. This is called late binding or dynamic binding. It's what's used in Java. And this is what we'll use in C++. So we'll see the solution, how to do this kind of thing, not in this particular case, but in other kinds of code in the next video.